My name is Elise Marlowe. I am 36 years old, a former U.S. Army captain with 14 years of service, including deployments in Kandahar and Fallujah. I have worn many uniforms in my life, but none prepared me for the one I wore the day my father burned my future to ash. I hadn't seen him in over 6 years. Victor Marlowe, my father by blood, but not by heart. The last time we were in the same room, I was leaving for my second deployment, and he barely looked up from his glass of whiskey. The air inside the law office that day smelled of lemon polish and expensive disappointment. Ellis and Rowan, attorneys at law, held the reading of my grandfather's will in a conference room that felt more like a sterile boardroom than a place where lives would be changed, or in my case, erased. I remember the cold weight of the chair under me as I sat down. To my left, my half-brother Grant Marlowe flashed me a thin-lipped smirk, the kind you reserve for people you think are beneath you. Beside him sat his wife Claudia, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes darting around like she'd rather be anywhere else. And then there was him, my father, Victor. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd overstayed their welcome. The only person who met my gaze with something resembling warmth was Sylvia Grant, my grandfather's attorney. A woman with sharp eyes and a voice so calm it could cut glass. She gave me the slightest nod before opening the leather folder on the polished table. She began reading in that smooth, even tone. To Victor Marlowe, my father, a charitable donation made in his name to the Veterans Integrity Foundation. To Grant Marlowe, the family cabin by Evergreen Lake and an antique coin collection. I could feel their postures stiffen. My father shifted in his seat. Grant's jaw tightened. Claudia's eyes darted toward me with a flicker of unease. Then Sylvia's voice changed just slightly. She looked directly at me. To Captain Elise Marlowe, my granddaughter, my only confidant. I leave the remainder of my estate, including all financial holdings, real estate, and controlling shares in Marlowe Industries. Effective immediately. There was a beat of silence. Sylvia reached into the folder and slid something across the table toward me. A check. I didn't touch it. I barely blinked. $58 million. Signed. Dated. Absolute. The room tilted. I heard Claudia's breath catch. I saw Grant's mouth falter into disbelief. But what I remember most is how still Victor stayed. The kind of stillness that only comes before a storm. Without a word, without even blinking, my father reached across the table and snatched the check from where it lay. His fingers moved with surgical precision as he pulled a silver lighter from his breast pocket. He flipped it open. The soft flick of the flame sounded deafening in that silent room. And then he burned it. Right there, right in front of me. The check curled in his hands, the signature blackening the edges glowing orange. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't fight back. I just smiled. Not the kind of smile you wear when you win. The kind you wear when you've already seen the ending, when you know something they don't. Because what he burned was never the real fortune. And in that moment, I remembered the words my grandfather whispered to me over cold coffee weeks before he passed. Words I had tried to forget but now rang louder than ever. Only open this if they try to erase you, because they will. They had, and I had. The flames flickered out. Victor dropped the charred remains onto the marble tabletop, as if he had made some grand gesture of victory. His voice, low and bitter, barely reached my ears. That's what you get for walking out. I didn't flinch. Not this time. Because somewhere deep inside the coat resting on my lap was an envelope my grandfather had given me. An envelope sealed in red wax with the truth tucked inside. A truth no fire could burn away. I looked at Victor, and I smiled. Because this wasn't the day they destroyed me. This was the day I began again. I remember the moment in perfect clarity. The way small, ordinary things sometimes imprint themselves deeper than the life-changing ones. The way my father's hand moved. Not shaking, not hesitating, as he reached across the table and picked up the check. The same hand that when I was 5 used to hold mine as we crossed the street. The same hand that when I was 12 dropped mine forever. He didn't look at me when he did it. His eyes stayed locked on the paper like it had insulted him. Victor Marlowe, a man who valued control above all else, couldn't stand the idea that the one person he spent years belittling, silencing, would inherit everything he thought was his by right. He pulled a silver lighter from his jacket pocket. Polished. Expensive. just like everything else about him, cold and manufactured. For one breathless second, the room was suspended. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Claudia's mouth hung slightly open, her eyes wide, but not truly shocked. More like she was watching a scene she'd rehearsed in her head, but never believed would actually happen. Sylvia, the attorney, didn't move. Her hands folded neatly on the table, her face a blank mask. But I caught it, the quick glance toward me, the almost imperceptible nod. She knew, she had known all along. And me, I sat completely still. My hands rested calmly in my lap. My heartbeat didn't even speed up. War teaches you that panic is optional. Reaction is a choice. He flicked the lighter open. The sharp metallic sound echoed off the glass and marble. The flame appeared with a soft hiss. And then without a word, he touched it to the edge of the check. The paper caught immediately. The edges curled into black, the ink distorted and vanished under the heat. He held it until the fire reached his fingers and only then dropped the smoldering remains onto the polished surface of the table. A thin tendril of smoke rose between us. No one spoke. Grant's face flushed dark red. Claudia's hand fluttered toward her throat. Somewhere in the back of the room, a floorboard creaked. But no one moved to stop him. I didn't move either. I didn't speak. I didn't even blink. I just smiled. Not out of defiance, not out of triumph, but because in that precise moment I realized something they didn't know. Something my grandfather had made sure only I could know. What my father had burned was never the real fortune. It was paper. Ink, a symbol. But symbols don't hold power unless you give it to them. Weeks earlier, over lukewarm coffee at a tired little diner, my grandfather had slid an envelope across the table to me. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet weight of a man who had lived long enough to understand betrayal. He didn't explain much. He didn't need to. Open this only if they try to erase you, he'd said. Because they will. I'd almost laughed at the time. My family had always been toxic. Yes, but erasure. That felt extreme. I left the envelope sealed, tucked it inside the lining of my coat, and told myself I was being paranoid. Until now. Until the precise moment my father set fire to $58 million. Like it meant nothing because to him, it wasn't about the money. It was about control, about legacy, about ownership not of things but of people. And this act, this theater of destruction, was his way of reminding me where he thought I belonged nowhere. I kept my eyes on the smoke as it rose and dissipated. I heard his words low and almost bored. That's what you get for walking out. I could have said so many things. Could have reminded him of the nights I slept in barracks a continent away, the blood I scrubbed off my boots, the way I buried pieces of myself in foreign soil while he sat in leather chairs in glass towers. But I said nothing. Instead, I smiled. Because I knew. Because deep inside my coat pocket was not just an envelope, but an entire truth. A carefully prepared, quietly executed safeguard that no fire could touch. And in that moment, I understood something else too. This wasn't about money. It never had been. This was about who I was, who I had become. And no flame, no lie, no act of erasure would ever take that from me. So I let the ashes fall. I let the silence stretch. And I smiled. Because they had already lost. I still remember the way the air felt when I stepped off the plane. It wasn't the heat or the cold. It was the weight. The crushing, invisible weight of coming home to a place that no longer knew your name. I had been gone for 18 months. Kandahar. Roadside bombs. Nights that stretched too long and mornings that never really came. I left pieces of myself in that desert, parts I knew I'd never get back. But I told myself home would be different. Home would stitch me together. I was wrong. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint on the shutters had faded. The grass was longer unkempt. But it wasn't the outside that undid me. It was the inside. When I stepped through the door, my father barely glanced up from the television. My stepmother muttered a polite hello, her eyes never leaving the screen of her phone. No one hugged me. No one said welcome home. I stood there, uniform, still crisp boots, still dusted with foreign soil, and they looked through me like I was furniture that didn't belong. I went upstairs to the room I thought I still had. I remember turning the handle and standing in the doorway stunned. The room was gone. The walls were painted beige. The bed was gone. My bookshelf, my medals, The flag I was handed when my best friend didn't come home gone. In their place were 2 beige armchairs, a potted plant, and a framed print that read, "Calm waters, peaceful mind." I stood frozen, hand still on the knob. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "Where's my room?" My stepmother passed by in the hall, mug of tea in hand. She didn't even stop walking. "We thought you'd moved on," she said lightly. "No sense keeping it as it was. You were gone so long. Gone so long. As if I'd gone on vacation. As if I hadn't nearly died more times than I could count. As if I hadn't spent nights writing letters they never answered." I slept on the couch that night. And when the morning came, I packed my things, the few they hadn't erased, and I left. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment off the highway, cheap and gray. It smelled like damp carpet and old paint, but it was mine. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself it didn't matter. But the truth is, that was the day I started to disappear. The last time I saw my grandfather alive was at Hillcross Diner, a place that smelled of burnt coffee and old vinyl booths. He was thinner than I remembered, his skin paler, but his eyes were sharp. Sharper than they had any right to be for a man 3 weeks from dying. We didn't talk about the past. Not directly. We didn't talk about the family either. We sat across from each other, sharing a slice of lemon pie that neither of us touched, and he asked about the war. Not the headlines, not the medals. He asked about the cold nights, the quiet, the ghosts you bring home in your bones. And for the first time in a long time, I told the truth. I told him about the friends I'd buried, the weight I carried. I told him about the silence that waits for you in the dark, the kind you can't outrun. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When the check came, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope yellowed at the edges. He slid it across the table without meeting my eyes. "Don't open this," he said softly. "Not unless they try to erase you." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "Erase me," he nodded. "People like them, they don't always come at you with fists. Sometimes they just stop saying your name. They rewrite the story until you're nothing more than a shadow." I laughed, awkward, uneasy. "That seems a bit dramatic, don't you think?" He didn't smile. "Trust me," he murmured. "There will come a day when you'll need to remember who you really are. And when that day comes, this will help you." I took the envelope, tucked it into my coat pocket, and we left the diner without another word. I never saw him again. When the call came 2 weeks later to tell me he was gone, I found the envelope still in my pocket. I ran my fingers over the red wax seal, but didn't open it. Not yet. Part of me thought I never would. I didn't find out I was legally dead until I tried to renew my driver's license. It was a Tuesday. The kind of day you forget before it's over. I'd waited in line for nearly an hour, shuffling forward, watching the clock on the wall tick by. When I finally reached the counter, the woman behind the desk took my ID, typed a few keys, and frowned. She tried again, and then again. Finally, she looked up at me with a kind of polite confusion. "I'm sorry," she said, "but according to the system, you're deceased." I blinked, not understanding. "I'm sorry. What?" She turned her screen toward me. My name, my birthday, my social security number. Status deceased. I felt the world tilt. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. "There must be a mistake," I said, voice thin. She shrugged helplessly. "You'll need to file a correction through vital records. It happens sometimes." But I knew. Even before I left the building, even before I sat in my car staring at my own reflection, I knew this wasn't a clerical error. Someone had done this. Someone had filed paperwork, forged signatures, submitted documents to the state. They hadn't just tried to take my inheritance. They had tried to erase me. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding in my ears. The letter in my coat pocket felt heavier than it ever had. The erasure wasn't symbolic anymore. It was real. I was a ghost. And I hadn't even seen it coming. The first name that came to mind was Naomi Blake. I hadn't seen her in almost 4 years. She used to work for the Department of Defense, specializing in forensic document analysis tracking. Falsified orders, forged signatures, and the kind of subtle paper trails that most people wouldn't notice until it was too late. We met during an investigation overseas. She helped expose a fraudulent contractor scheme that nearly cost lives. Back then, we made an unlikely team. She behind a microscope, me in uniform. But we shared one thing: neither of us liked to be lied to. I still had her number saved under NB, just 3 letters and a memory of the one person I knew who could help me now. I texted her first, unsure if the number even worked. I kept it simple: need help, urgent, Elise Marlowe. Her reply came 3 minutes later: come to the shop. I found her in a cluttered office above a locksmith's in the old industrial district. The place smelled like toner and stale coffee. Files were stacked in uneven towers, and a single dusty window let in just enough light to keep it from feeling like a cave. Naomi looked exactly the same: short hair, dark-rimmed glasses, a permanent expression that hovered somewhere between skepticism and exhaustion. When I stepped through the door, she raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I handed her the envelope, the letters, the documents I'd gathered, the forged death certificate, the fake notarizations. She didn't ask why I had them. She didn't ask what I needed. She just said, sit down. I watched as she unpacked tools, magnifiers, UV light scanners. Her fingers moved with the precision of someone who knew that every dot, every curl, every micropressure of ink could tell a story. I need to know if any of these are real, I said quietly. And I need to know who did it. Naomi nodded without looking up. Give me 24 hours. I almost laughed because after everything, after months of feeling like I was screaming into a void, here was the first person who didn't look at me like I was invisible. I left the office with nothing but the weight of waiting. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. The next afternoon, Naomi called. Her voice was flat professional, but I heard the undercurrent, something close to anger. Come back. I found what you're looking for. The sun was low when I arrived. The office felt different, smaller somehow. Naomi sat at her desk, surrounded by printouts, side-by-side comparisons, and a laptop showing magnified images of signatures in microscopic detail. She didn't bother with preamble. Your father's people lifted your signature from your 2018 military discharge packet, she said, pointing to one of the screens. They scanned it, cleaned it digitally, and applied it to multiple documents. The transfer of your grandfather's assets, the amendment to the will, even the death certificate, they're all fake. She tapped another page, this one glowing faintly under ultraviolet light. This is where they got sloppy. The pressure patterns don't match. The ink deposition is inconsistent. The notary seal is legitimate, but the signature over it isn't. I leaned forward, my breath tight in my throat. The images blurred in my eyes. How certain are you? 100%, she said, without hesitation. This would fall apart in any competent court within minutes. I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly. They didn't just try to take your money, Naomi continued softly. They tried to erase you, legally, permanently. I sat back, the weight of it pressing down on me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low hum of her desktop fan. Eventually, Naomi slid a folder across the desk. This is your proof, she said. Affidavits, forensic analysis, everything you need to challenge this. I took it with both hands. It felt heavier than it should have. Because it wasn't just paper. It was my life, my name, my existence documented and defended at last. I looked at her, unsure how to express the gratitude that words couldn't carry. She just shook her head, her expression softening. Don't thank me yet, she murmured. You still have to decide what to do with it. I nodded. I already knew. The decision led me to Marcus Lane. I had never met him before, but I knew his reputation: investigative journalist, the kind who didn't flinch when the stories got dark, the kind who'd exposed corruption in city governments, unmasked white-collar criminals, and survived 3 lawsuits without blinking. We met in a quiet diner outside the city. The place smelled of old coffee and fried food, and the waitress didn't even look up when we slid into the corner booth. Marcus was younger than I expected. Mid-30s, wore a denim jacket and carried a notepad the old-fashioned way. His eyes were sharp, though too sharp, and I could tell within seconds that nothing I said would shock him. I laid the folder between us. They declared me dead, I said flatly. They faked it. The signatures, the legal filings, everything. He didn't interrupt. He just flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning faster than I could follow. I watched him as he worked. Watched the way his brow furrowed, the way his jaw tightened as the story came together. Finally, he set the folder down. Do you want this public? He asked quietly. Or do you just want leverage? I hesitated. The question felt heavier than it sounded. I could have walked away. I could have used the proof in court quietly. Could have taken the money, the name, the title, and left the rest in the ashes where it belonged. But I thought of the look in Victor's eyes when he burned that check. I thought of the silence in the room when no one stopped him. I thought of the years they spent telling me I didn't matter. I want the truth to work harder than their lies, I said. Marcus gave a small nod. I can do that. We talked logistics, timelines, protections. By the time I left the diner, the first draft of the article was already in motion. I stepped into the cool night air, the wind brushing against my face. For the first time since this began, I felt steady, solid, because I wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. I was fighting to be seen. The article dropped at 7:03 a.m. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee untouched in front of me when my phone buzzed with the notification. Marcus Lane had delivered exactly what he promised, clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. The headline stretched across the top of the screen like a wound-decorated war hero. Declared dead by family in $58 million inheritance fraud. The subheadline cut even deeper. They didn't just steal her name, they erased her existence. I read the opening paragraph twice. I barely registered the words, but I felt them. Every syllable like a pulse in my fingertips. I was no longer invisible. Within an hour, my inbox exploded. Former colleagues, veterans I hadn't spoken to in years, friends I thought I'd lost, screenshots, messages, one after another. Some asked if it was true. Others just wrote, "I see you. I believe you." By noon, the story had spread across half the internet. Military blogs, legal forums, social media threads, hashtags, commentary. People who'd never heard my name were suddenly saying it like they knew me. They called it the Marlowe erasure. Some were outraged, others fascinated. The idea of a family so cold, so calculating, that they would legally declare their own child dead to seize an inheritance. It was too twisted to look away. I scrolled through the comments in silence. She served her country, and this is how they repay her. Someone get this woman justice. And then my family tried something similar. Not at this scale, but I believe her. I wasn't prepared for the number of people who saw themselves in my story. People who'd been erased in quieter ways, disinherited, disowned, dismissed. The floodgates opened. Survivors of narcissistic families, veterans discarded by the system, women whose voices had been silenced in boardrooms and battlefields alike. I felt something shift inside me. For so long this had been personal. A wound I carried in isolation. But now it was bigger than me. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a mirror, a spark, a warning. The backlash against Victor began within hours. Old colleagues distanced themselves. Corporate partners issued vague statements. The stock price of Marlowe Industries dipped 2% by the close of the market. But what struck me most wasn't the financial fallout. It was the silence from my family. No calls, no emails, no attempts to explain, to defend, to control the narrative. They had underestimated me. They thought I'd stay silent, that I'd disappear the way they intended. Instead, I had told the world. I spent the rest of the day holed up in my apartment, the curtains drawn. The weight of it pressed against my ribs, thick and dizzying. Every ping of my phone sent fresh adrenaline through me, but I forced myself to stay grounded, to breathe, to stay still. Late that night, I stepped outside for air. The sky stretched wide and dark above me, stars barely visible beyond the city haze. I let the cold sting my skin. The wind cut through the edges of my coat. I was alive. And now, the world knew it too. I knew it was only a matter of time before my father fought back. He was never the type to sit still when control slipped through his fingers. The first blow landed less than 24 hours after the article went live. I was in my apartment when I saw it, a live interview on a local news channel. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Victor Marlowe responds to inheritance allegations." He sat at the center of the frame, dressed in one of his signature navy suits, an American flag pin carefully placed on his lapel. His expression was composed, almost paternal, the kind of calm you rehearse in front of a mirror. "I want to begin," he said, "by saying how much we love Elise. We've always loved her. But she's struggled since her deployments. There have been mental health challenges, things none of us fully understand." He paused, looking down as if gathering himself, as if this performance required effort. "We did what we thought was best to protect the family and, frankly, to protect her from herself. Sometimes when people come back from combat, they carry invisible wounds. And sometimes those wounds, they can distort reality. I sat frozen, hands clenched so tightly my knuckles blanched white. He had chosen his weapon carefully, not facts, not evidence, doubt. He wasn't just discrediting my claim. He was rewriting my entire existence, reducing everything I'd done, every choice I'd made to the product of a broken mind. I felt the old weight settle over me. The same weight I carried years ago on a different battlefield in a different war. I thought I had left it behind. I thought wrong. My breath came shallow as my mind slid backward unbidden to the moment I knew I'd never see the world the same way again. Kandahar. The dust so thick it felt like breathing through cotton. I'd been ordered to authorize an airstrike on a compound flagged as hostile. The intel was shaky, the satellite images unclear, but I'd seen them. Through the scope of my rifle, I'd seen the shapes small, fragile, unmistakable. Children, I refused. I radioed command and said no. I took the heat, the accusations, the investigation. I wore the fallout like a second skin. I'd made peace with that decision a long time ago, but now Victor was using it, twisting it, turning my refusal to kill into a question of sanity. I forced myself to look back at the screen. His voice was soft now, almost breaking. "We ask for privacy," he said, "and we hope Elise finds the help she needs." The interview ended. The anchor moved on, but I couldn't. I sat there in the dark, the echo of the past and the sting of the present crashing into each other. I had faced enemies before, but this was something colder, something far more dangerous. I didn't respond to the interview. I didn't call the station or release a statement. I knew better than to fight noise with noise. Instead, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and did what the military had taught me to do. Better than anything else, I prepared. The folder Naomi had given me lay open across my table. Page after page of forensic analysis signature overlays, time-stamped reports. Every piece of evidence cataloged, numbered, irrefutable. I ran my fingers over the documents, not for reassurance, but to ground myself in what was real. They had built their lies on paper. I would tear them down the same way. I copied every file to 3 separate drives. One for Marcus, one for my attorney Sylvia, one for safekeeping. I drafted affidavits, reviewed old military records, pulled every piece of documentation that tethered me to the truth. Birth certificate, deployment orders, medical records, photographs that couldn't be doctored. Each time my hands started to shake, I stopped, breathed, began again. There was no room for emotion here, no space for anger. And strangely, I wasn't angry anymore. That feeling, the raw acid burn of betrayal, had receded. What filled the space instead was something colder, sharper. Clarity. I wasn't fighting for revenge. I wasn't trying to punish them for what they'd done. I was fighting to reclaim something far more fragile and far more dangerous to lose. My name, my voice, the right to exist without apology. I sat back in the chair watching the city lights flicker beyond the window. My reflection stared back, haunted, yes, but unbroken. I wasn't the girl who had left for Kandahar. I wasn't the daughter who used to beg for her father's approval. I had become something else entirely. I had become still. And in that stillness, I understood something vital. Sometimes survival isn't loud. It doesn't scream or lash out. Sometimes survival is silent, a quiet refusal to disappear. And that, more than anything, was the weapon they could never take from me. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the courtroom was how quiet it was. Not the absence of sound. There were whispers, the shuffle of papers, the creak of wooden benches, but the kind of stillness that presses against your skin. The kind that says something important is about to happen. I sat at the petitioner's table, hands folded back straight. Beside me was Sylvia, calm and poised, her expression unreadable. Across the aisle sat my father, Victor Marlowe, immaculate as ever. His suit was pressed, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes were cold, flat. I didn't bother looking for my brother or Claudia. They were there, but they didn't matter. The judge, a woman named Rena Kinley, entered and took her seat. Her reputation preceded her strict no-nonsense, and known for having zero tolerance for theatrics. She adjusted her glasses and spoke with quiet authority. "Let's begin." Sylvia rose first. She moved with deliberate calm, her voice smooth, unwavering. Your Honor, we are here today to contest a fraudulent suppression of identity, forged legal documents, and the unlawful transfer of estate assets, she said. This is not simply a matter of inheritance. This is about erasure. Her words landed softly, but they carried weight. Every syllable deliberate, every pause sharpened. She submitted the documents Naomi had prepared, highlighted comparisons, pressure pattern analyses, digital overlays. The judge nodded, flipping through them carefully. Then Naomi was called to the stand. She looked smaller under the courtroom lights, less like the sharp-eyed forensic expert I'd met in her cluttered office, and more like a quiet truth-teller summoned into battle. But when she spoke, her voice carried clear and steady. I conducted a forensic examination of the documents in question, she began. The signatures were not original. They were scanned reproductions lifted from Captain Marlowe's military discharge papers, digitally altered and fraudulently applied to multiple estate documents. She explained the science, the inconsistencies, the tells only a trained eye would notice: the absence of ink, lift the artificial uniformity of the signatures, the micro-variations that didn't match natural handwriting. The judge asked questions sharp, precise. Naomi answered each without hesitation. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. Then Victor's attorney, a slick man named Price, rose, trying to inject doubt. Is it possible, he asked, that these discrepancies are the result of simple clerical error? That no malice was involved? Naomi didn't blink. No, sir, she said flatly. These are not clerical errors. These are intentional acts of forgery. The weight of her words hung in the air. I felt my heart beat steady, not quick and steady. This was no longer a question of whether I could prove what had been done. The proof was here, laid bare under courtroom lights. For a brief moment, I let my eyes drift to Victor. His jaw was tight, hands resting on the polished table, motionless. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. I already knew. Sylvia sat back down beside me, her hand brushing briefly against mine, not for comfort, but as an anchor. The first shots had been fired, and for the first time I felt the balance begin to shift. When Sylvia stood again, there was something different in her posture. Not sharpness, something quieter, something certain. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady but low, with the court's permission. We'd like to submit video testimony recorded by the decedent, Mr. Marshall Marlowe, 3 weeks prior to his passing. The testimony addresses both the intent of his estate and the actions currently in dispute. The judge gave a nod. I didn't move. I barely breathed as Sylvia pressed play. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the video filled the screen. There he was, my grandfather, sitting in the old sunroom I remembered from childhood. The light poured through the windows behind him, casting soft edges around his thin frame. He wore his favorite cardigan, the one with the missing button, and his hands, those once steady hands, rested gently on the arms of the chair. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear. If you're watching this, he began, then I suppose things went the way I feared. He gave a small, sad smile, the kind you wear when you know you've already lost pieces of yourself along the way. I built what I built because I believed in something more than money, more than power. I believed in legacy, the kind you can't measure in numbers, the kind that outlives you because it touches something real. He paused, looking directly into the camera, and for a moment it felt like he was looking right at me, like he was still alive. They may try to rewrite this, he said. They may try to bury you under paper and lies. They may even try to erase your name. But listen to me, Elise. The truth doesn't burn. His voice barely trembled. They can set fire to the symbols, to the checks, to the signatures, but the legacy I leave you, what matters, cannot be destroyed. It cannot be reduced to ash. Because it was never built on paper. It was built on trust. Another pause. This time, longer. His eyes dropped for a moment before rising again. If they try to bury you, he said, his voice quiet but firm, let them learn that some things can't be buried. Some things rise, some things endure. He exhaled, the faintest trace of a smile returning. I chose you because you told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. Because you stood where others bowed. And because you understand that real power doesn't need to shout. The screen faded to black. The courtroom held its breath. And in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of everything shift. They hadn't just tried to take my inheritance. They had tried to burn my name. And now the world knew. The words themselves were simple. This court recognizes Captain Elise Marlowe as the rightful heir to the Marlowe estate and sole controller of Marlowe Industries. All prior actions taken under false authority are hereby voided pending criminal review. That was it. No fireworks, no shouts, just a quiet sentence delivered by Judge Kinley in her usual steady tone. The sound of her gavel striking once echoed across the courtroom like a distant drumbeat. For a moment I didn't move. Sylvia leaned slightly toward me, whispering, "It's done." But I didn't feel done. I looked across the room at Victor. His hands rested tightly on the polished wood of the table, his face frozen in a mask of control that cracked at the edges. His lawyer sat motionless, lips pressed thin. Grant and Claudia were absent, silent ghosts in this final act. I didn't look for their faces. I didn't need to. I wasn't here for revenge. I wasn't here to see anyone break. The truth is, when you spend years fighting to be seen, to be heard the moment you finally are, it doesn't come with thunder, it comes with stillness. A quiet so deep it feels almost sacred. I rose slowly, the weight of the courtroom pressing against my shoulders. Sylvia gathered the files. Naomi gave me a brief nod from the back, but I barely registered it. My hands felt steady. My breath was even. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I simply stood in the center of that wood-paneled room, letting the words settle, letting the gavel's final echo fade into the walls. No applause, no celebration, just breath, just presence. Victor didn't meet my eyes when I walked past him. I didn't offer him the satisfaction of anger. I didn't offer him the mercy of hatred. I offered nothing at all. Outside, the air felt sharp against my skin. The courthouse steps stretched downward into the hum of distant traffic. Reporters clustered at the edges, but I kept walking. There was no victory in this, only the quiet restoration of something that should never have been taken. My name, my truth, and the deep, unshakable stillness of knowing at last that I was no longer theirs to erase. It happened on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after the verdict. Ordinary day. Pale winter sunlight, the sharp bite of cold against my skin. The city moving around me as if nothing had changed. I was walking out of a small cafe, nothing special. Just a quiet place I stopped at, sometimes when I needed to think when I saw them. Grant, Claudia. They were standing on the opposite corner, half turned toward each other, waiting for the light to change. I froze for a moment, not because I was afraid those days were gone, but because for a split second I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be in that moment. The sister, the stranger, the survivor. Claudia saw me first. Her eyes widened slightly, her hands tightening around the shopping bag she held. She nudged Grant with her elbow, a quick reflexive gesture. He looked up. His face barely shifted, but I saw it, the stiffening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes. The light changed. I didn't move, neither did they. For a heartbeat, the world held still. And then quietly, almost imperceptibly, Grant looked away. Claudia followed. They stepped back from the curb, turned down the side street without crossing their backs, rigid, their pace just a fraction too quick to be casual. They didn't speak to me. They didn't nod, didn't wave, didn't even try for one of their old brittle smiles. They simply walked away. I stood there and watched them go. No anger, no satisfaction. Just a strange, quiet detachment. The way you feel when you see a house you used to live in and realize you don't remember what the inside looks like anymore. For so long, I had been chasing something I couldn't name. Closure, maybe. Justice. An apology that was never coming. But in that moment, standing on the cold pavement, I understood something simple and final. They weren't my family, not anymore. Not in any way that mattered. I wasn't carrying the weight of their choices on my back. I wasn't shrinking to fit into the spaces they allowed me. I wasn't erased. I was here, solid, breathing, unbroken. I let the breath go slow and steady and turned away. I didn't look back. Some ghost deserved to stay behind. I wasn't looking for him. It just happened. I had stopped by the courthouse to file paperwork for the foundation routine mechanical. And as I stepped back onto the street, I caught a glimpse of someone sitting alone on a weathered bench by the fountain across the square. It was Victor. For a moment, I thought I was wrong. The man looked older, smaller somehow, his once impeccable posture sagging under the weight of something I couldn't name. He was alone, No lawyers, no polished entourage. Just him, a faded coat pulled tight, his hands resting loosely on his knees. I stood still, half-shadowed by the archway. He didn't see me, or maybe he did but chose not to react. His eyes were fixed on nothing, a space beyond the fountain, beyond the city, beyond even the shame he had tried so hard to bury. And for the first time in my life, I saw him, not the man who burned my name, not the father who gutted my childhood with sharp words and cold silences, but the person beneath all of it, small, tired, unraveling. I don't know how long I stood there watching him. A minute, maybe two. Long enough for something to shift inside me. Because the truth, the one I'd avoided admitting even to myself, was that once a long time ago, he hadn't always been this way. The memory came unbidden. I was 5 years old, sitting on his shoulders at the county fair, his hands held tight around my ankles, as I laughed at the lights, the noise, the spinning colors that painted the night sky. I remember the warmth of his voice when he told me not to let go. I remember believing completely, utterly that he would always catch me if I fell. For a while, he was that man. For a while, I was his little girl. But somewhere along the way, between ambition and disappointment, between ego and fear, something in him fractured. And instead of facing it, he buried it. He buried it so deep that by the time I returned from the war, there was nothing left to salvage. Only armor, only calculation. And I had spent years trying to make sense of the pieces. Now, standing across from him, I understood something I hadn't before. It wasn't personal. It was who he had allowed himself to become. The difference was I had stopped carrying it. I didn't approach him. I didn't call his name. There was nothing left between us that required words. Instead, I turned away. My steps felt light, not triumphant, just free. Some endings don't need confrontation. Some endings are quiet. And sometimes the greatest victory is walking away, not out of bitterness, not out of hate, but because you no longer need to be part of their story. I let the city swallow the distance between us, and I kept walking. In the weeks that followed, people kept asking me the same question. Would I press charges? Would I seek damages? Would I make them pay? I understood why they asked. In their eyes, this was a story of revenge. A woman wronged a family, exposed a legacy nearly stolen. And now, the world waited for the final blow, for the punishment, the destruction, the spectacle. But that was never what I wanted. Not really. I thought about it, of course. Late at night, staring at the ceiling, tracing the edges of every betrayal in my mind. The temptation to scorch the earth they walked on was real. The chance to ruin them the way they tried to ruin me, financially, socially, legally, was fully within my grasp. But when I closed my eyes, what I saw wasn't victory. It was emptiness. It was me still tethered to them, still shaped by their shadows, still giving them space in a life they had forfeited the right to touch. And I knew then, deep in the marrow of who I'd become, that my freedom didn't live in their downfall. It lived in my refusal to care. So I chose not to press charges. Not because they didn't deserve it. Not because I forgave what they had done. But because I wasn't willing to let them be the center of my story anymore. I drafted one letter, formal, precise, severing all remaining legal and personal ties. And then I let it end. Quietly, completely. I didn't answer their calls when they came. I didn't read the apologies, the half-hearted explanations, the denials dressed up as remorse. I deleted every message. I let the silence grow between us until it became a border neither side could cross. And I moved on. Not with vengeance, not with bitterness, but with something softer, something steadier. I moved on because I could. Because surviving wasn't enough. Because living, truly living, meant knowing when to lay the weight down and walk away. And that's exactly what I did. The first time I unlocked the door to the new building, my hands trembled. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even excitement. It was something quieter, something that felt like reverence. The space was small, tucked between a shuttered bookstore and an old barber shop, the windows clouded with dust from years of neglect. But it was mine. And more importantly, it was for others. I used the settlement funds, what remained after legal fees and estate transfers, to establish the Marlowe Foundation for Women Veterans. No fanfare, no headlines. Just paperwork, quiet determination, and an idea that had been building inside me for years. I didn't want to create another charity that handed out hollow promises. I wanted to build something real, something I would have needed when I came home wearing invisible wounds no one wanted to see. The first program focused on legal aid for female veterans facing wrongful discharges or benefits denial. The second, career transition services, because too many women I served with were left to fend for themselves in an economy that didn't know what to do with them. I built partnerships. I called in favors. I found allies, people like Dean Ellis, a Marine-turned-social worker who knew the terrain I was navigating. But more than anything, I made one silent promise. This space would belong to those who had been erased, silenced, discarded. The first time I walked the empty hallways, I could still hear echoes of what my grandfather once told me. Make something they can't erase. I repeated those words under my breath as I rolled paint onto the cracked walls, as I scrubbed floors with my bare hands, as I signed the first grant applications. For the first time in years, the weight I carried began to shift. Not because I had forgotten what they did to me, but because I had finally decided what I would do with it. Her name was Tori. She came through the front door one rainy afternoon, shoulders hunched, hands buried deep into the pockets of her jacket. She looked tired, frayed at the edges, but there was steel in her eyes, the kind you don't learn, the kind you earn. I sat with her in the small corner office, still bare walls, still the scent of fresh paint, and I listened. Tori had been dishonorably discharged after filing a harassment report against her commanding officer. She told her story in pieces, her voice flat, her fingers twisting a paper cup. She had lost her benefits, her housing, her sense of herself. And as she spoke, something in me broke and stitched together all at once. I remembered that silence, the way the world shrinks when no one believes you, the way you start to question whether you were ever real to begin with. I didn't offer her platitudes. I offered her resources, a legal contact, a temporary housing referral, a cup of strong coffee, and a chair that didn't judge. But more than that, I offered her presence. When she left that day, she didn't say much, just a quiet thank you and a half smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I sat alone for a long time after she was gone, because it hit me fully for the first time. This was never just about me. My story, the lies, the courtroom, the broken family, that was one thread. But the tapestry was so much larger. There were thousands of stories like mine, women who had served, who had sacrificed, who had come home to doors that wouldn't open. I wasn't carrying just my own name anymore. I was carrying theirs too, and I intended to hold that weight with both hands. The day we installed the permanent sign above the entrance, I stood on the sidewalk for a long time before reaching for it. The letters were simple, understated. The Marlowe Foundation. Below that, smaller words etched into brushed metal for those they tried to erase. I ran my fingertips over the cool surface. For a moment, memories pulled at me, dusty courtrooms, burned checks, the cold weight of betrayal, but they no longer owned me. They were ghosts, distant and fading. What remained was this: a building, a mission, a life reclaimed not through vengeance, but through creation. The team gathered behind me, Dean, a few volunteers, and the first handful of women we'd quietly begun to serve. I could hear their voices, soft and steady, filling the space I once thought would always feel empty. I lifted my hand and pressed it flat against the sign. Just for a second. No ceremony, no speeches. Only breath, only presence, only the simple, profound truth that we were still here, that they hadn't won, that they never could. And for the first time I smiled, not the practiced smile of survival, but something real, something rooted, something unshakable. Then I stepped inside the door, swinging closed behind me, and the work continued. I didn't expect to see Grant again. It happened in the most ordinary way outside a bookstore, the wind sharp with early winter. I was locking my bike when I heard my name, soft but unmistakable. Elise. I turned. He looked thinner, worn, the sharpness that had always defined him. His voice, his eyes, his smile had dulled. Beside him, Claudia lingered, hands buried in her coat pockets, her gaze flickering down as soon as I met her eyes. We stood there in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that isn't really empty but full of everything unsaid. I heard about the foundation, Grant said finally. It's good. What you're doing. I nodded but said nothing. He cleared his throat. The words caught. He tried again. I just wanted to say, I was wrong. About a lot of things. Claudia shifted uncomfortably beside him. She didn't speak, but her eyes just for a moment held something fragile. Regret, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. I studied them both. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the weight of old battles. What I felt was distance. The unbridgeable kind. The kind where the past is carved so deep it leaves nothing but scars. I appreciate that, I said quietly. And I meant it. Even if it was too late to matter. Grant nodded. His shoulders sank as if something unseen had finally slipped free. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for connection. And for that, I was grateful. I hope you're okay, he murmured. I gave him a small, steady smile. I am. They turned first, walked away together, their footsteps soft against the pavement. And I stayed. In the stillness that remained, I realized something simple but profound. Closure doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes it comes when you no longer need one. When the formal transfer of Marlowe Industries finalized, the board offered me the seat they once tried to steal. CEO, chairwoman, control. It would have been so easy to take it, to step into the power they denied me, to wear the title like armor and reshape the empire in my image. But I didn't want it. The truth was, I never had. I sat alone in the boardroom the day the papers arrived. The city stretched wide beyond the glass. I thought about everything it would mean: control, legacy, revenge, neatly folded into corporate language. And I felt nothing. Because what they built wasn't mine. The machinery, the wealth, the endless climb, it belonged to the old world. The world of men like Victor. Men who thought power was the only currency that mattered. I had already found something else, something steadier. The Marlowe Foundation was growing. We'd just opened a second location. The walls were still bare, but the rooms were filled with voices, with stories, with women who'd been discarded and were starting again. That was the work that mattered. That was the place where I belonged. I signed the final document transferring full operational control to an independent trust, and I walked out of the building without looking back. I didn't need their empire. I had built something they couldn't touch. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving someone else's world. I was living in my own. The air was crisp the morning we unveiled the new center. I arrived before dawn, the streets still soft with quiet. The building stood clean and steady beneath the soft glow of street lamps. The final brass plaque had just been installed the night before. I reached out and ran my fingers over the words. For those they tried to erase. I stood there for a long time. Not because I was thinking of the past. Not because I was haunted. But because I understood finally that every step had led here. Every silence, every betrayal, every moment I thought I wouldn't survive. They had shaped me, but they hadn't defined me. I carried the keys in my pocket. Small, simple. But to me they weighed more than gold. They were permission. They were freedom. I took a breath deep and full. And I stepped forward. No fanfare, no cameras. Just the sound of my own footsteps steady on the pavement, carrying me into a future that no one could write for me. I had made something they couldn't erase. And that was enough. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.